Can you guess what I've been playing for the last few weeks? Yeah man, Helldivers, it's the shit. I never was interested in the original because it was a top-down affair, but I always thought, hey, if this were anything else, I'd be happy to try it, and what do you know, my wish came true. Can you believe this stuff was published by Sony? What a sick joke that turned out to be. I'm sure nowadays we're all so used to Sony being the movie game company, the guys responsible for inflicting The Last of Us 2 on the world and infecting entire generations of developers with the idea that they need to emulate film more than they already did. Film, that thing the entire industry had been trying to one-up for years, trying to prove that video games were just as valuable of a medium as anything made in Hollywood. Like, yeah, sure, for a long while games had references to film, or would try to emulate certain ideas or scenes in a video game format, but in the end they were still trying to be their own thing, just, you know, very poorly. The idea that Sony was anywhere near this game is insane to me. That the company so dedicated to making hack wannabe films allowed anything even remotely silly and enjoyable at face value makes me wonder if maybe, just maybe, there's hope for this industry yet. Don't hold your breath, brother. I'm just postulating my angle of opinion.
That you are simply espousing your angle of opinion?
I actually remember shitting on this game when I first saw gameplay because I thought it would just be a boring, lifeless slog like every other Sony shooter with open world elements. I knew people who played the first game, but I was never interested in it. Yeah, I played top-down games like Foxhole in spite of their perspective, not because of it.
Love me, Lancaster. Ain't the callers,
Yeah, love that, yeah.
The racist doesn't like them.
Then I saw some gameplay, tried it out, and kaboom. Instant democracy enjoyer. You might even say it's because there's something about Helldivers, except I'm not supposed to say that because it's not one of those videos. This is an Archduke of Suno video, subsection A, unfair comparison, etc, etc. So then why is this game doing so well, especially compared to the typical Sony property? What makes Helldivers take off like a phenomena that overloads servers like it's going out of style? It's very simple, really. Helldivers is designed around core gameplay elements which directly contribute to both an exciting gameplay loop as well as encouraging a feverish emotional investment in the world of Helldivers as a whole. Every other game Sony's associated with does not try to do this, and I have plenty of examples.
Now, I am an owner of several firearms myself. Just because they are airsoft replicas doesn't mean that they're any less legitimate.
Simply put, Helldivers puts gameplay at the forefront of its design both as a narrative element as well as for its fun explosions and devastating battles. It's all about dropping in, blowing up the enemies of freedom, and getting out. It's an excellent idea at face value for its novelty and the high-intensity combat it tends to create, but it's equally as effective at ingratiating the player in the world of the game and really making them feel like a Helldiver. Say the one I wanted to say.
6 out of the 10.
Yeah, that's the one I wanted!
You have maintained our way of life.
That feeling of being the thing you're playing as has become a general rarity in the AAA space, and Sony in particular. For the modern Sony title, there's an endless insistence to play as a character that's not yourself for the purpose of experiencing a story that will be fed to you in whatever way the developer sees fit. Sometimes this is a good thing to do, or is the only thing you can do given the central premise of a title. For example, that old Telltale Walking Dead game was always going to be about two specific characters that you play as, and have less to do with player expression or allowing them to fully embody the role of the character that is Lee.
I have a big dick axe.
It's pretty much, like, look at the framing.
Yeah.
It's pretty much just, I'm gonna kill these zombies with my big dick axe.
But even then, The Walking Dead did have some player agency. It wasn't much, mind you. In fact, it was barely relevant to the game outside of aesthetic changes, but at least you could make them. Sony games have no such niceties. Choice in any way is stripped from the player in favor of the railroading set out by most of the designers. Sony games have gameplay that rely heavily on a far smaller, less intense, and generally less difficult, and that's not always true, style of gameplay. In fact, it often seems that Sony games include their combat more as a requirement and less as an interesting or expressive way to communicate theme, narrative aesthetic, or the like. In Helldivers, the entire premise stems from being a badass soldier. You shoot guns and make number runs. The gameplay and the story are basically the same thing. The story is, there are bad guys who hate our way of life. Go and stop them, and that's it. The rest of the game's story is driven entirely by the players on the galactic map, with the devs playing along, of course. Modern Sony titles, and let's be honest, most modern action titles as well, tend to scoff at this. They say, you're gonna play the way we tell you, and you're gonna feel what we tell you to feel. And that's it. Take the God of War reboot, for example. Once upon a time, God of War was this super fun action game about killing the Greek gods and being generally homicidal against cool monsters and big, exciting locales. They'd go balls to the wall on presentation and became staples of the Sony brand for years. New God of War is the exact opposite. New Kratos is slow, the camera is pulled in too close to allow any actual fast or expressive gameplay. Most encounters in the later stages of both games boil down to spamming abilities off cooldown and dodging obvious attacks that have to be very obvious because the camera is just so dumb. I mean, why do this? I'm serious. This isn't a shooter. You're not being clever. The game feels so slow. Just pull it out, dude. Old God of War zoomed the camera out so you could see the excellent level visuals and to give you a better perspective of you and your opponents. It was dynamic too, zooming in on your gory executions and following you more like a fixed camera from an old horror game rather than your run-of-the-mill action title. Ironically, Helldivers is a shooter and does let the camera move. It's pulled back enough to give a good field of view, zooms in just enough to make leveling your weapon feel smooth and not constrained. You could even go first person while aiming down the sights for better accuracy, and also just as a fun side thing. I mean, the camera does bug out, you can just reset it by going to first person. It's just nice. Movement in New God of War is slow and plodding, where once Kratos could leap large bounds, he's defeated by even the most menial of pits and waist-high walls. It doesn't mesh well in your head either in terms of gameplay or setting and character. Kratos is only a badass when the game says he's allowed to be one. When a scripted cutscene gives him the power he and the player once wielded as the original Ghost of Sparta. Helldivers though? I mean, what, did you miss the little line on the ground that said only heroes past this point? The game is all about giving you power, about letting you use it to its fullest extent. You can even use it on your friends if you're so inclined. Get out of the way!
You keep shooting so close to me. I'm going to die.
Fuck you!
Fuck gorillas.
Did I just see what I thought you just did?
Stuff like the weapons have this perfect combination of distinct rapports with the utter destruction each one inflicts. The shooting following a separate cursor like it's Arma or something. Enemies have entire chunks and limbs torn from them with your attacks, and likewise the same thing can often happen to you. Reload a little faster. Oh, that was almost really bad. Oh! Oh my god!
I got you.
Thanks, man.
That's not even to mention the stratagems which annihilate swaths of foes while also actively deforming the earth like battlefield. Every little thing helps to lend more weight and power to your actions by giving them the feedback that in other games is just lacking. Many games in the Sony roster are happy to take their combat at face value and ignoring the details of what actually makes that combat satisfying. God of War only allows for brutal or impressive kills in what few scripted instances there are. I think the best part of Helldivers' gameplay loop is something I like to call the scramble. You know how in Halo you have the dance when two people run into each other in a game of Slayer or something? Helldivers has the scramble, and it looks something like this.
It's not done yet.
It even has the
Oh, it wants me.
It even has that game, even like this game concept they're trying to pitch, where it's like
What the fuck?
Okay.
Oh no! What the fuck? You just suck.
Okay.
We're
okay.
There's no tripping in the game. It just fucking like acted like there was an
We're
explosion
okay.
behind me and threw me on the ground.
It might look like people are panicking when this happens, but really it's just an elongated maneuver to reposition, and it even changes form depending on the enemy you're facing, with the bots obviously encouraging you to get into some cover while the Terminids just... You gotta get away. I mean, come on, dude. Then you just turn around and start blasting like it's going out of style. Every fight can become this chaotic whirl of monsters and munitions, and the wide variety of stratagems and enemy types means that those engagements never turn into the same basic fights, especially at higher difficulties. I'm getting some good headshots off of that railgun.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it?
I still really like the... Oh! No!
Jesus. I can't wait to go home and see my family.
Oh no! Objectives too are a breath of fresh air. While there are the standard, kill a bunch of dudes or push a button to do a thing, there's other objectives, both mandatory and optional, which make missions much more dynamic than something like a Destiny strike. The best choice they could have made was to make higher difficulty missions not have stupidly strong bad guys, but instead adds extra objectives and larger patrols, meaning that it's the number of foes and the very problems you're trying to solve actually meshing together in a way that isn't frustrating. You won't get one shot by a level 199 stalker bug with the packing heat perk, which makes it deal 5.3% extra damage on a Wednesday. You just have to fight more, which encourages you to bring your friends.
It fucking...
Oh fuck! Speaking of Charger, shit!
No, what, I got him, it's okay, see?
20...
Rewards are equally as nice. You're working to upgrade your ship and unlock new weapons, gated behind the only monetization system I've ever seen that's actually fair and reasonable.
Democracy fills my sample container.
You get those super credits, the premium currency, by finding them in missions, and then you spend them on the war bond, which is like a battle pass, except it's not timed, and it's much nicer, I promise. Stratagems are locked behind a totally different resource because they're that important. Not to mention that the idea of limiting your ability to annihilate your foes from orbit would just be so shitty. You can imagine that alternate universe Helldivers where you have to pay real money to call in railgun shots or 500 kilogram bombs, and that just hurts my soul. All the things you need to be a hero are available to you free of charge. The fun isn't gated by money, only your time investment and ability to pay attention to the map. The final ship upgrades need high-tier samples, which only show up on hard missions, so you gotta play well too if you want those. By that point though, you're probably well on your way to being a Helldivers regular, blasting bugs and bots for liberty and seeing just how far you can go to spread democracy to an oppressed galaxy. In short, your badassitude is tied directly into the gameplay, which you're responsible for. Everything you do is done by you for real, not in some crappy cutscene. The only cutscene that is supposed to be cool is the one where you drop in, which is presented with style, because that's the point of the cutscene. It's cool! The idea that a game which so heavily focuses on its mechanical experience is incredible. Sony has never really cared for that after the release of stuff like Last of Us because it just didn't seem convenient to focus on them when visuals or feelings were more important.
Smoking weed is not a crime. It is a way of protesting the government.
Now visually, most Sony titles are actually quite good. They do tend towards that photorealistic style, which we could debate if that's actually a good idea, but I'm not interested in that. What I am interested in is the general aesthetic and the user interfaces which adorn most modern games, Sony included. The modern action title, trademark, love using these awful, frustrating UI elements that still flabbergast me every time they show up. And the most devastating one is this. Alright, this is gonna sound pedantic, but I fucking hate damage numbers. Damage numbers are the worst defense towards player immersion for the purpose of telling you how much damage you did, even though you didn't need to actually know that. Shooters with quick times to kill use it even though it's pointless, and RPGs use it to make all your weapons feel like they do peanut damage. You need to do all this damage and you pour all these bullets into an enemy just to piss you off. My favorite example is to imagine something like Stalker with damage numbers, and you'll understand exactly what I mean then. Or, you could just go install the mod that does that, and then you're really in for it. Modern action games love to add non-diegetic information like this, from damage numbers to health bars or the ever-frustrating glowy attack indicator, flashing the most obvious and blatant signs in your face that, hey dude, an attack is coming, you idiot. Sekiro did it once, and now they can't help but put it in literally everything. It's just terrible. Horizon, among plenty of other non-Sony games I could mention, are rife with this assault on the senses. You just lose so much when you do it. It's only meant for certain situations like RPGs, things like Borderlands, and any game where exact numbering is actually relevant to other mechanics. Helldivers easily could have done this, but instead it relies on the far more visually pleasing and just more fun idea of visually depicting your damage by shaving pieces of the enemy and showing their actual reaction to the damage instead of just a number going down. It makes the combat far more visceral and evocative, which is something that we've seen in Sony properties before. Just makes you wonder why they're anywhere near this game. They've already declared that their long-term business strategy is to focus on more games like what they've done in years past. The only possibility is they somehow took an actual risk, which is unlikely, or they just didn't have any faith in Helldivers, which the lack of advertising would suggest. That also gives them an even greater excuse to make more interesting foes, by the way. The bugs and automatons have distinct profiles, sounds, and effects which fills them with so much character, even if the bugs are obviously just a Starship Troopers reference and the robots are basically just Terminators. Not to mention, it has details where it matters, not just visually, which frankly isn't that hard anymore. It's just applied inconsistently. It's got all the little things games miss out on, like...
Ooh, yeah, hey, hey.
My name is Chris, I'm from Boston.
And see, he plays a nasheed. He played an Islamic nasheed at me.
Now this isn't going to sound all that impressive at first, but I need to point it out. Helldivers has an actual soundtrack. That shouldn't be all that notable. Key phrases shouldn't, because games don't really do that anymore. The most you'll get is a generic orchestral soundtrack with little in the way of any style, variation, theming, or frankly anything that would actually indicate the score is original at all. There's unique themes for the different enemy factions, larger boss-like foes, an actually good main theme, and boy, that extraction theme is just... it's just swell. When looking through the modern Sony catalog, we get some guitar tracks from The Last of Us, like maybe 1 or 2 tracks from the new God of War, but that's sadly it. To be fair, the entire industry as a whole hates the idea of putting in good OSTs, even though that was the standard since, like, the goddamn NES, man. I mean, come on. The same can be said for those little fun details the game includes. Here's just a small list. Weapons drop the mag when you reload, but you can still get one in the chamber, and reloads are staged, so you can drop the mag, fire your one in the chamber, then reload for a full weapon. Most weapons have extra functions like fire select, toggleable flashlights, which is a rarity somehow, fire rate adjustments, toggleable sights, and that silly unsafe mode for the railgun. Enemy behavior changes depending on the type and damage they've taken. Losing limbs will impact movement, and attacks mean you can tear some bots apart and they'll still charge at you to try and run you over. If you prime a stratagem and then get knocked down, you'll drop the stratagem like you're through it, meaning you could easily call a bombing run on yourself if you're not careful.
Oh no!
Oh, you fool.
Bro, the Devastator just like fucking just appeared and was like, you died.
All the planets look excellent and come with their own weather effects, which make the missions harder. They also have a real-time day and night cycle, which can change mid-mission depending on where you are on the planet. You can play actual games of rock, paper, scissors.
Dude, is that how you also do the too slow with the high five?
You can kill any enemy by dropping in on them from your health pod. The ships in orbit are meant to actually indicate the number of players also fighting on the planet, and they even fire off stratagems and drop pods down to the surface. And you can even dab on your friends like the zoomer you are. I'm not moving until...
Shake his hand.
And all these things are just there for fun. In most cases, you really don't need them. After you activate that, you should stand in place.
You actually, there's 2, you have to activate it twice. So you activate it once, and then you have to stand there. And wait for it to...
Yeah, whatever you do, don't run away from it like we are. One in the chamber is barely noticeable. It's 1 bullet. But it's fun to have. Rock, paper, scissors is a meme, but it's fun to have. Insta-killing guys with your drop pod is... okay, it's actually kind of a dumb idea, because you can just one-tap Bile Titans, but it's really fun. Again, it's all about empowering the players to have fun with the sandbox, not boxing them into a particular role, which is the Sony and industry standard. That comes with the general look of the game too. This silly far future where Super Earth needs you. That's right, you. I'm sure some people will insist on reading into it, be like, oh, you're the bad guy though. It's like Starship Troopers. You're dumb for thinking you're the hero. Shut your mouth and look at my airstrike. It's meant to be fun, you ingrate. And let's be honest with ourselves, who's really the bad guy here? The bug hive mind that wants to kill everyone, the automaton bots that want to kill everyone, or the walking bush admin parody? There's no comparison here. The Helldivers might be bastards, but there are bigger bastards out there. I mean, just watch that final monologue from Team America World Police. You'll get what I mean. Playing as a Helldiver is just cool. They wear capes for God's sake. Guys in armor wearing capes is just cool by default. It should be added to like quantum physics, man. It's practically an equation at this point.
Most animes are stupid shit for pedophiles, but some of them are actually pretty cool.
There's something really special about games which so heavily encourage the active participation of the community in making the game what it is. Helldivers involves the community through its seamless drop-in, drop-out multiplayer and its overarching story and game mechanic of this galactic war where all the players are helping out, fighting the enemy. It encourages everyone to work together, communicating about what planets it might be best to fight on, exchanging strategies and loadouts, as well as encouraging people to actually play the game in co-op. It's a dangerous thing to do this, of course. Giving players a real stake in the outcome of the game can lead to problems. Foxhole isn't a Sony game, but it's a good example. An excellent game about two factions fighting a war against each other. Players have to make all the items and weapons and work together in the long term to win the war. It was a really fun game, but over time the ability for players to communicate became strained, especially as larger clans took over most of the resource output, which meant solo players weren't able to affect the war the way they'd hoped to. Helldivers isn't at risk of that given that's all PvE and there's no such resource strains, but the principle remains the same. Player-driven systems can be difficult to implement. Sony's answer to that problem is obvious. Never try to let the players and the community at large affect anything. To their credit, that's because most of these games are single player anyway, so it's not like that's possible, but in instances where they could do that, like a revamped Last of Us multiplayer or something, they just never tried. And really, why would they? Allowing players and communities to influence their game would defeat the point of their games entirely. It's not meant for you, it's meant for Neil here. Helldivers' community-based emergent story is much closer to something that an MMO would have, game masters included. By actively trying to keep the community engaged in a long-spanning galactic conflict, it makes everyone's contributions feel important to the grander narrative, even if they're technically not all that impressive. It takes a lot of work to get those planets liberated, but it's all about that democratic spirit. Everyone getting together and enjoying their story, not the developers. That's an idea that Sony simply can't attempt out of fear of, well, something that I honestly can't gauge. Again, it really makes you wonder why Sony is anywhere near this game until you remember that they were sort of just obligated to do so from some contract they signed back during the original development for the first Helldivers. Already, Helldivers 2 has sold an outrageous share of copies, putting some actual high-profile Sony releases to shame, while maintaining a player base for more than just a month, which so many other live service games, they just can't pull it off. 400,000 concurrent players is a big deal, and having that consistently is just outrageous. This ain't a New World situation where the game drops off the face of the planet almost instantly. This shit is still going. It helps too that Arrowhead are committed to having a much more open, though still productive, developer cycle. New stuff is supposed to come out at least once a month, and while I'm sure there'll be some variance in how much stuff that actually is, the promise of more stratagems, weapons, the coming vehicles, and of course that mysteriously missing third enemy faction means that not just hardcore players will be sticking around to keep diving. If Arrowhead are able to capture that elusive, casual audience, the players who hop on during the weekend, usually playing some trash like Warzone so they can total another monitor after getting jumped for the 12th time today, doing that will prove that having a game that puts fun first and monetization and the more devastating elements of modern design trends far behind is exactly what you should be doing as a developer. Not telling your shitty story, but letting players tell theirs. Sony doesn't deserve Helldivers. They're not the kind of company that respects these types of games, hence the lack of support and advertisement before launch. It's their job to try and mitigate this kind of thing, and yet the only support the game has gotten is the form of the devs themselves. Sony left this game out to dry. A small-scale investment in something they don't favor. A niche they'd rather have left unfulfilled. And yet suddenly the game blew up in their faces. Every other modern Sony game has never been received like this. Not God of War, not Spider-Man, not Horizon, definitely not The Last of Us. These games all had some kind of controversy to make them noticeable. They were talked about for a time, but not with the kind of fervor you'll find if you just type Helldivers into a search bar somewhere. It's because of all these things and more that make it so good, so notable and lovable. Its gameplay is excellent, and no knows how to apply the basic ideas of a shooter in such a way that each encounter remains fresh and exciting, even if the setup seems mostly the same. A Sony game can only rarely accomplish the same thing, usually in the form of a highly scripted, unique encounter, rather than characterizing all encounters in general. Every drop feels different, even though you might be fighting just the two same factions currently in the game. The multitude of stratagems and weapons means you can play almost any way you want, within reason, of course. The new vehicles are gonna be real fun, and when it all comes together, it's gonna show that creating a player-focused experience is perhaps what the future of the industry really needs. Sony games don't view the player as being all that important. The game being a thing for the developers is all that matters. So what the players feel when playing it is entirely reliant on the devs' perceptions matching what their consumers see. And for Sony products, that just doesn't happen enough. The most obvious example is Last of Us 2, a game which was horribly divisive because in essence, it focused on trying to be a big deal thing with all these highbrow ideas, but in the process, it spat in the face of the players who found value in other ideas. This kind of design is something you'd see in the indie scene, or, well, you would see it in the indie scene if it was still worth a damn. It's not a coincidence that the best game you could compare Helldivers to is Deep Rock Galactic, a game well known for its excellent style of drop-in, drop-out co-op gameplay. The question then is this: what lesson will Sony be taking from Helldivers? There are, in my opinion, two ways this pans out. Number one, Sony will begin to rationalize that player-centric design trends, particularly those in a live service genre, are a winning strategy going forward, and that perhaps a pivot from their far more controversial design imperatives should be in order. Or, two, they'll view Helldivers' success as a fluke, or perhaps worse, perfectly adequate for the Sony brand, that they could use this just one time as their success for the live service genre, and then just kind of ignore it for the rest of the time. They could simply return to their industry plans and make story games. Story games which more and more are coming under scrutiny because they simply can't drum up the same power that something like Helldivers can. Arrowhead, for their part, have done an excellent job. They're working hard to upend the current perception of live service games, which might actually be a part of Sony's reluctance to lean into these elements. The modern live service title is often a boring cash grab with extremely unfair monetization and inadequate content updates, which leaves the game stale and boring. I like Darktide a lot, but it's basically that to a T. It's fun, but only if you can put up with it. Helldivers doesn't feel like that though. In fact, it doesn't feel like anything made in the modern day.
What have you people fucking done? You imbeciles! You buffoons! You have vexed me!
Leave me alone, Bugs! Leave me alone! It's a throwback to what made something like a Left 4 Dead fun. The unremitting chaos, the inclusion of every necessary element in the game, just as a matter of course. No endless infatuation with story or character. All that stuff is left up to you, its burgeoning community, to enjoy or, in some cases, create. The devs could take their hand off the reins and get back to making exciting experiences, or argue about whether there should be swords in the game or not. In the end, Helldivers is a lesson about taking a step back as a developer or publisher. It's about starting from the position of what the player is going to enjoy most, not so much what's emotionally gratifying or touching or if the game is difficult enough or not. It's about letting the player have fun, whether they're chalking up another victory for democracy or being totally annihilated by a rocket. You're weak, robots. And dude, it's $40 freaking. That's like unimaginable. There's basically no excuse for you not to be playing it right now. Democracy needs you now, brother. What the hell are you waiting for? We got some liberty to spread.
What a sorry state we're in.